start to identify some creative solutions. And we call this the ideate phase. So if you have problems that students need to solve, then what are the solutions to them? So, for example, students need to gather the skills in order to move their professional lives on, for example. Well, actually, one of the ways that we might ensure that students develop the skills through the learning process, especially in a professional context, is that we design their learning experience to be one that is authentic. So a task that is used for assessment, for example, would be a task that's very similar to the professional task that they would use in the workplace. And then where I think design thinking really, really comes to the fore is that based on all of the other 3 phases that you've been through, the empathize phase, the define phase, and the ideate phase, you then start to build a small prototype, a small example of the learning experience that you want your learners to have, to see whether or not it's possible to create that. And then once you've built that prototype and you've shared it with the key stakeholders, preferably with learners, people who might potentially be undertaking this course, you gather their feedback, you test it, you gather their feedback and you make changes. And you then, from those changes, you potentially go back to empathizing or defining or ideating and then prototyping again. Now, it's a constant cycle of improvement, and where we use design thinking in our processes, that's very much what we do. We use the prototype phase to build a small sample of the learning experience, and then we put it in front of the key stakeholders and we try to gather feedback from them. We make changes and then we put it back in front of them again, and we try and have an optimum experience, but recognizing that you can't just keep iterating. You have to actually go with a learning experience eventually. And so sometimes that prototype and test phase is quite short, and sometimes it's quite long. And ultimately, it's a really, really scalable way of building a learning experience. So what I wanted to do for the next couple of minutes is to take you through some of the phases that we would potentially work with when I work with clients, and ask you some questions and give you some things to think about in terms of the questions I would ask if we were all sat in a room or on a webinar together undertaking a design thinking workshop. And please feel free to share some of your comments in the chat. But one of the early ways that we start to empathize with our learners is to establish a vision for that learning experience. And one of the ways that we collect that information is we say to participants in workshops, so we want to know what your students would say about your program or your course 1 month after starting it, 6 months after completing it, or 3 years after completing it. And we choose these types of timings to follow a student through a particular life cycle of the program. So 1 month after starting a program, a student might say, I found signing up for the program, registering and enrolling on the program really, really easy. It was, I had enough information to make the choices I needed to make. With a response like that, you're then assuming that the onboarding experience that you're going to design for your learners is simple. And yes, I would talk about strategy, vision and mission, and then I would talk about the tactics. This leads you down that route. So once you've started with what the vision is of a really easy onboarding experience, 6 months after completing, students are saying, I feel that I've learned enough to move on in my career, that I am able to move myself forward, that the knowledge I've gained has been directly applicable. all of the things that you're saying in those statements are hinting at the direction of travel for your program. And then, of course, if you're looking longer term at 3 or 5 years after completing the program, this is the kind of thing that you want your alumni to be saying to you. And one of the things that we do when we go through a workshop process like this is I have a collection of Post-it notes of different sizes and different colours. And we put them all together and we sort through them all and we find key themes. And that ultimately helps us encapsulate the student vision for this programme. And so that's how we undertake the empathise phase. We then start to think about who our learners are, because what you want your learners to be saying at the end of a programme is often going to be driven by some of the demographics of their own demographics and how they're going to come to the learning. So on average, online learners are in their late 20s to their mid 40s. I think on our online learning programs that we support with our partner universities here in the UK, the average age of our learners is 37. 50% of the learners on the online programs with our partner universities in the UK live overseas from the UK. So whether that be in Europe or in Asia, America, South America, Australasia, and that many of their motivations are career focused, and some of them are studying just for fun, but the majority of them are there to study for progression in their careers. Then we also need to know a little bit about what they like and what they prefer in terms of their learning. Do they prefer learning in groups of people? Do they prefer a lot of self-study? Do they like undertaking authentic tasks? All of those sorts of things. And we do a lot of research into what we call learner personas that ends up giving us these pictures. How do they like to learn? We'll try and come back to that, Anka. We'll try and come back. And we do quite a lot of research with learners about their preferences for their approaches. And then we also think about the challenges and obstacles they have. So some of them are quite standard. We know that there are in some geographies that there are challenges around access to technology. So, good fibre broadband isn't available in all parts of the world, but in some parts of the world, they have an awful lot of very, very good 3 and 4G connections. So that technological challenge may be something that we need to consider. Other things that we may need to consider are long working hours, the part of the world that they live in, and how that coincides with our teaching concurrently or synchronously. And we spend a lot of time with this research. We have a research team that do much of this, and it leads us to pull together these kinds of learner personas. And by understanding the learner personas, and depending on the size of your screen, you may or may not be able to see the detail in these. When you get the slides, you'll be able to see a little bit more. You can see that there can be some quite different things that stop people or are challenges to people in terms of their learning. So if we focus on the pain points for these 2 example students, for one, they have challenge around a disability. If being deaf, that may make their learning difficult unless we adjust for that. Also, there are personal conflicts in terms of family and money and time that we would need to take into consideration. Whereas for the other candidate, potentially she's shy, she finds it difficult to network, doesn't have a lot of experience of group work. So there's a lot of information in these kinds of profiles that allows us to then say, in terms of design thinking, how do I solve these problems? And that's the next stage. And then if we're looking at how we identify these common challenges, so common challenges like access to technology, common challenges like time, common challenges like not being experienced in working collaboratively online, that then gives us ideas about how do we design a course that supports students to achieve even when they do have these challenges. So a learner that doesn't have a huge amount of time or is potentially has a lot of other commitments and they need to be very focused in their study, we design a course so that it reduces the cognitive load on them, that everything is in a common place, the interface is very, very simple for them to use, that there's a coherent journey with plenty of instruction. That's one of the ways in which we solve that challenge. When, for example, if we've got a challenge around group work and people aren't particularly used to working in groups professionally, we all have to work in groups. And then ultimately, we need to provide students in the learning experience with small opportunities to practice working in groups so they gain confidence. It doesn't affect their grade, so that when they do have to work in a group for a grade, they're able to do so more successfully. Now, it's difficult. I can't take you through the next two phases. I can't prototype some learning for you and I can't test that learning with you. But hopefully by using those first three phases to show you what we can do, you can see how considering that empathetic approach to learning really helps us focus on the learner and deliver significant value to learning experiences by designing them in response to those learners' needs. Okay, I'm going to quickly take a pause. I'm wondering, Justina, whether or not there's any burning questions. Now, I remember Anchor asked a question about how do you understand about learners' preferences? As you talk to learners, you'll have learner feedback from learners that are on your courses already. If you're moving into online learning from classroom-based teaching, as you start to think about who you're going to market your courses to, your market research people and your marketing people will start to think about these learners. They'll talk to learners. And actually, you can almost ask them, what things in learning do you really appreciate? What resonates with you? How do you prefer to undertake your learning? And learners will be really, really open with you and talk to you about that. There's also quite a lot of research, existing research, in the higher education sector that talks about learner preferences. There was also some really useful Pearson-Wonke research that was done over the summer in the UK around learners' experiences of online learning through COVID. And there's some really useful insights in that. How do you get this feedback from larger groups? You have to talk. Well, if you're talking about your own learners, I prefer to use live feedback mechanisms, live and anonymous feedback mechanisms. So things like Mentimeter. But also you can just do it through focus groups and you can do it through conversation. Okay, I'm going to quickly move on because I've noticed the time and people will be cross with me if I'm late. So now I'm going to open, let me see if I can get this. I would like you to type into Mentimeter if you can. What three words come to mind when you think about online learning? And hopefully this is going to give you a word cloud, she says, hopefully. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes on Mentimeter to do that. And I'm going to try and find you some research, if I can find a browser really quickly. Wow. So I've put one of the reports there in the chat box, so you should be able to get access to that. If I can find the next one quickly during the session, I will do so. And if not, I will try and arrange for it to be added to the chat before we close the session. Okay, I'm going to stop voting. Look at you guys. You're doing a phenomenal job. Oh dear, I saw the word boring come up there. No, definitely not. Oh, technical issues. I like the things that are small around the edge, but what I really, really like is the big motivation in the middle and the flexibility. And that's brilliant. I've never used word, I'm going to tell you this is a secret now. I've never used word clouds in Mentimeter with such a large group before. And so that is awesome. Okay. I want to quickly move us on. So how is online learning different? One of the ways that I like to think about it is that online learning is different from class to class, classroom, face-to-face teaching in classrooms. When I teach in the classroom, which I haven't done for a couple of years, but is in my background, I would spend some time preparing for my teaching. And when you first start preparing your lectures, it takes a really long time, but then year on year, the preparation time and your own confidence in your ability to teach gets slightly less. But in terms of the amount of time I would spend getting ready to teach in the classroom, it's absolutely nowhere near as much time as I need to produce the learning experience for online learning. So preparation is very much an individual task, and it's for the faculty member, the academic, to do that. Production is very much a group task. Producing good online learning takes a range of professionals and also a number of different people in order to make that technology work. The second thing I think that is very different is that in classroom teaching, although we've become far more innovative in the last 15 or so years in how we teach in the classroom, with problem-based learning, scenario-based learning, authentic activities, group work, actually there's still a reliance on quite a simple mode of delivery that is often very much focused on the tutor or the lecturer, broadcasting didactically to students. Whereas in online learning, you have to think of many different ways of presenting the information and the learning activities to meet the various different needs of learners. And so, especially if you're embracing design thinking, and then you're also additionally embracing universal design for learning, which is about ensuring that your learning is accessible, then you have to have many approaches to learning, not just one. I think that online learning is different because the tutor has a very different role in online learning. They aren't just the subject specialist. They are there helping students, facilitating students to make their own meaning and learning out of a learning experience. And that's a very different space to be in. And then finally, one of the things about online learning that is very different is that it is democratizing for learners and provides them with more choice and more flexibility about how and when they learn. And classroom-based teaching is very much at the dictate of the university of when it's available, the times it's available, the campuses that it's available on. Whereas if you're an online learner, you have a lot more choice about when you engage with your learning, how you engage with your learning, and what approaches you want to take to it. So I think those are four quite simple differences, but really quite powerful. And so I'm going to move on. Oh, questions have really quietened down. I'm going to quickly move on. and talk about some effective practice. So I have another opportunity for you to use Mentimeter. I'd like you to rate these. So if you're on the app, the rating is quite interesting. You have to remember to click in each of the, it comes up on your screen. You get like a little wheel that you can select the most appropriate phrase from, and then you can put them in an order. Remember to click on each separate box to put the results in. Okay. I'm hoping that you're able to, oh, look at that, all started. This is really interesting. I'm liking that not many of you think that they're easier. Few. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple more seconds to pull through these results. How do I integrate Mentimeter into my presentation? I have a Pro Mentimeter account. Well, Pearson has a Pro Mentimeter account, and so you can upload your own PowerPoints and then insert the slides. That was me yesterday evening deciding that I was going to do it this way. Okay, I'm going to stop voting and let's talk about these for a little bit. So learners are very isolated. I think that there can be, in terms of online learning, that your learners can be quite isolated if you don't give them reasons and opportunities to talk to each other and talk to you. And so again, by design, you have to build in opportunities for students to talk to each other. It's difficult to know how my students are progressing. So I'm going to say it again. By design, you build in opportunities to show you how your learners are progressing. And even better, because they're in a virtual environment, you have loads of data to show you how they're progressing. The analytics that sit in most virtual learning environments now are brilliant at showing you what students are engaging with. The quality of the experience can't be as good as on campus. I think it can be better than on campus. I've worked in some really, really horrible campuses. But actually, if you can't get to campus, the virtual learning environment is your campus. Okay. Again, there can be learner collaboration if you design it in. And I don't think that online courses are in any way easier than face-to-face courses. In many ways, they're a lot harder. So I'm going to move us on. So from the negatives, I'm also now going to ask you to think about the positives before I get to move on. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to work your way through prioritizing these. If you could, that would be great. A quick look at the chat. Students don't like you experimenting with them. Yeah, they don't like you experimenting with them, but you do it in a low risk way. My students used to dread the start of a semester, and I would say to them, oh, we're just going to be doing this, whatever this thing was this semester. I've seen it and I think it would be really good fun. And they would all groan at me and we'd have great fun doing it. I hope that learning will remain online when there's the opportunity to return to campus, because I think there are some huge benefits to students having access to learning online. Okay, this seems to have calmed down a little bit, so I will close the voting. I think it challenges us to be more innovative in our teaching. So even if you're not doing fully online learning all the time, there are so many things from the pros of online learning that you can borrow in your face-to-face teaching that I think really enhance the learning experience. One of the reasons that I'm passionate about online education is that thing that it opens up educational opportunities for learners, gives them more choice. And having been in leadership roles in universities, it's a really, really difficult thing for a university to expand beyond its campus in its city, especially when your population isn't necessarily growing, and there are plenty of people that want to learn around the world. I think that it's really, really, there are lots of really good things about online learning that we can take forward. So I'm now going to take you through really quickly some of my top 10. There's 10 of them. Top things that as an academic teaching online, it's really, really important to think about in terms of effective practice. And I've been watching some of the chat, and you've all been talking about many of the things that you're doing, and especially the technologies that you're using. I think that it's really, really important that you use the technology for what it is good for. So know the technology that you have and know its affordances. Don't try and eat soup with a spoon. Don't just use a new piece of technology because it looks like it might be funky. She says, just having integrated Mentimeter into her presentation for the first time to 480 people. But I know that it's a technology that works, and I know that this is what it actually is good for. Use your learning technology teams. If you have a good technology team, use them to help you make choices about the technology that supports your learning needs. Make them do a little bit of empathetic work with you, excuse me, to understand what your needs are for your learners and help recommend that technology. Online learning and expectations is massive. So students, if they get the wrong expectations, if they are not able to see clearly what they need to do and what they want to achieve, then you can end up with a mismatch. So it's always important to be really clear from the very start what you want from your learners and what they need to do in order to be successful. That isn't just the case in online learning, it's the case in all types of learning. But I think in online learning, where there's an opportunity for many things to be missed because you aren't necessarily having those casual conversations, it's really clear to have those expectations set from the start. We've done a little bit about this already today. Understand the needs and the circumstances for your learners. Knowing where they're coming from and what's happening with them is so important. Even if at the very start of your course, if you want to know, if you're running an online course and you want to know where your learners are, have a short quiz with them, find out where they're from, find out what their circumstances are, ask them the questions. I was able to see this morning as you all joined and said hello that there's people from all over the globe. I saw there was somebody from Indonesia, so there were people in Russia and in the Ukraine and all over Europe. You don't necessarily know that from your online learners when they first come in. You may know that if you get their registration details from admin, but actually just ask them, and getting them to introduce themselves and tell you their circumstances is really, really important, because it also helps them understand their relationships with each other. Students, I get many of the concerns about isolation in online learning. It's important that as academics, we design learning activities that make purposeful use of collaboration and communication. That actually we're designing activities that mean that students, if we're asking students to talk to each other, there has to be a purpose for why they're doing that. Otherwise, they won't bother to do it. If we're asking them to work in a group, to collaborate over the development or research of something, whatever that might be, there has to be a purpose for them doing it as a group rather than just doing it on their own. There has to be a benefit to them. So always think about what is the benefit of me asking the learners to undertake this activity in a collaborative way or to undertake this communication, and be very clear with them why they're doing it and what they'll get out of it. If you're able in online learning to use synchronous sessions, and not all online learning sessions do that, if you're able to use synchronous sessions and have learners come together on a webinar like this, then actually use that to develop the group and the community dynamics. Don't use it as a lecture. Don't use it to just broadcast your voice. Use it to bring their voices in as well. We say doing a broadcast webinar today, but it's really, really important that the learners are able to talk to each other and that you develop that sense of community. It's also important if learners are often studying at a great distance, they're squeezing their learning into small parts of their time, that we are able to demonstrate to them their progress. I think that it's much more exciting for learners to see their own progress than just you to see their progress. So that isn't about setting up competition within your courses so that learners see how they're doing in comparison to other learners, although I do know that some courses do that. It is about them being able to say, well, actually, when I came into this course, I didn't know very much about whatever your discipline is. And the outcomes are telling me that I will be able to do A, B, and C by the end of it. And as they're going through the course, they're really able to consolidate their understanding of key points and say, and recognize for themselves that they're achieving that outcome. We do this most commonly by using prior learning activation tasks. So when learners first come into a course or first start a topic within a course, that we start an activity that gets them to draw upon their existing knowledge and gets them to kind of clearly state where they feel they are, whether we use that through a quiz or through discussion forums. And then as we progress through the topic, offer them opportunities to then either test their current knowledge at that point in time or to reflect back on how their knowledge and understanding has changed. So prior learning activation and then, or diagnostic testing, and then later opportunities to explore the learning journey, for me, work really, really well for learners. So I've got 9 things here that are my top tips, and there is a 10th. Of course, there's always a 10th. So first of all, you use the tech for what it's good for. Don't try and eat soup with a fork. Make sure that you become quite confident in the use of that technology and use it well, or be willing to have slight technology hiccups in the process of doing it, which now I'm quite used to doing, having spent a lot of time on webinars. Be really clear about what's expected from your students and minimize surprises to them so that they can focus on learning. Recognize that learning online is often likely to be new to students. Many of them are returning to education after a break, and they probably need to understand what's important to them. Make sure that you communicate effectively and give opportunities for them to communicate. Make collaboration, working together, purposeful. And then also build in synchronous time to build community if you can. Number 8 is help learners check their own progress. And then there's also, as we're in an online environment and a virtual learning environment, there's data that you can use to check student progress and to help you understand what are the bits of your course that learners get on with, which are the bits they find difficult, to look at the performance of individual learners, and don't always focus on the learners who aren't spending very much time in the VLE in some respects. I'm less worried about them when I'm teaching online. I'm more worried about the learners who are in the VLE far too often and spending too much time in that environment, because they're likely to be the ones that are struggling and are in trouble. And then my final tip, which you're not going to be surprised by at all, is that you always have to focus on the learning and the learners and not on the technology. And if you maintain that focus, I absolutely believe if you maintain that focus on the learner and the learning, then the technology problems and challenges will sort themselves out. So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm hoping that Justina is going to tell me that we've got a nice range of questions for me to answer. I did see one that said, where did I get my images from? So some of my images are Pearson images. We've just had a rebrand. We've got a great load of new images, and others of my images are from things like Creative Commons, and where I've taken them from people's websites, you'll see that there's some URL links to where those are from. So I try to be as compliant as I can. I know, love the visuals. I know, pictures, much better than words. So Justina, have you been able to pull some questions together?
There are some questions. For example, Nico is asking how important it is to have all courses in your curriculum aligned for the online learning, to have identical expectations from the learners.
You know what all of the research, every single piece of research around online learning and student expectations talks about consistency. And so the learning experience needs to be consistent, that it isn't fair. It's a bit like every time if you think about, the analogy I'm trying to make is that if you're a learner and you come and you're studying 2 or 3 modules within a course, and every time you go into one of those modules, it looks different and it feels different, and the academic is behaving differently and has different expectations of you. It's like when you go into the supermarket and they move the toilet rolls. And they don't just move the toilet rolls once a month, they move the toilet rolls every single time you go in there. Or they've moved the particular brand of coffee that you like. And the particular brand of coffee you like is no longer with all the other coffee. They've hidden it with the gourmet stuff 17 rows away in the supermarket. And that's what it's like for an online learner. If you can't be consistent in those expectations, it's like trying to find the gourmet coffee that's hidden behind the toilet rolls 19 rows away from where it should be.
Thank you. There's also a question from Sarah. Would you say that there is a certain time frame that you need to adhere to? For example, don't teach online course longer than 30 minutes at a time.
We've just sat here for an hour. I think it depends what you're doing. So if you are pre-recording video and you want students to watch videos, and of course they've all got closed captions or they've got transcripts and all of these other things, you should really try and keep your video recordings less than 15 minutes, which means that you probably have to do lots of small ones rather than one big one, or you may be able to do one big one and just have it edited down. But for a webinar, if you're doing lots of different types of tasks, then actually you can have a webinar for an hour, because if you break that up with different types of activity.
Yes, and a question from Pierre about flipped classroom. Do you have any recommendations for getting students to engage in flipped classroom group work online?
Oh, that's a toughie. So flipped classroom, just in case anybody has been under a rock for the last 5 years, is where you basically provide quite a lot of information before the class, all of the theory, potentially readings and things like that, online for students to work their way through. And then when you bring them into the classroom, you make the assumption that they've done all of that work before they arrive, and then you're going to do really active things in the classroom. My experience with the flipped classroom is, Pierre, as you say, they come to class not having done the work because they don't think that it really matters. And actually, it's about establishing for them Students only really need to have 1 or 2 very bad experiences to learn that they need to do things for themselves. And I would introduce the flipped classroom quite slowly. So in the very first year that they study, that you give them smaller discrete tasks to do before they come to the classroom. And I would build up the level of responsibility. So if you want students to do a lot of reading, a lot of preparation, a lot of research, for example, before they come in, you're not going to get your first year students to do that because they won't have the confidence to do that on their own. You need to build their confidence that they're able to do that work without you sat by their side in order to have that collaborative experience in the classroom. So I would build it up.
And there's, sorry.
So I'm just a realist. Yes, I'm a realist and a pragmatist.
And there's also one more from Pierre. He says, I also teach a game-based simulation management class using a proprietary software. I found that online classes allow for much more flexibility for game-based type classes, especially ones where the game can be stretched over a whole term. Any recommendations there?
I like gamification, but I think it's one of these things that if you gamify something, you're giving students the opportunity to practice and fail, and actually they should be failing. They shouldn't just be succeeding all of the time. I'm a big fan, and I don't very often talk about Pearson products, but I know that our Pearson marketing strategy, for example, my marketing strategy is a great way for having that gamification over a long period of time. Online learners like gamification so long as it doesn't have to be synchronous. So if you are supplementing gamification for classroom-based, and it can be asynchronous, so they can do the tasks at different times. I think that's great. If it has to be synchronous, it's really challenging for online learners, because how does the poor person that's in Indonesia 8 hours ahead of you work with the person that is based in New York who is now 13 hours behind them? That is really difficult. Which one of them has to be up at 1 o'clock in the morning to do the activity?
Thank you. And we've got one more from Sheila. What is the most ideal class size for online classroom?
So it depends. At the moment, it seems to be about 463 would be my guess, which is how many there is in this room. No, I'm kidding. When we set up a scaled online delivery of a program, we would normally have 1 tutor supporting up to about 25 to 30 students. And it doesn't mean that 1 tutor only supports 1 group, but it does mean that the students are in a group of 25 to 30 of peers that they get to know very well. Any group larger than that is quite difficult to manage in a webinar situation because people find it difficult to talk. You really only can use the chat. You can't necessarily use verbal communication. If it's a purely asynchronous course, then you probably can have a larger group than that. And MOOCs have shown that you can have very, very large online groups, but still people kind of get a bit lost if it's anything more than about 50. In terms of tutors, though, I think a group size of about 25 to 30 to manage online is a great group size.
Thank you. And we've also got a question on the skills that are required from online teachers, professors. Do they need to be defined or redefined? And how would academic teaching staff for the future of teaching would look like? How much should be teacher competence? How much should be provided by the institutions? So generally speaking about future professors to be.
I think that if you are, and we have this debate in the UK quite a lot about what are the skills that are necessary for members of academic staff. And I think it does depend on the discipline that you teach and also the type of university that you work for. You know, it's important for staff that teach on nursing programs to have a background in nursing, and actually they need to be good nurses first, good academics second, and probably good technology enhanced learning academics third. But I think that there's an expectation, if the pandemic has done nothing for us, it means that academics have realized that technology enhanced learning is something that they kind of have to get to grips with. All the feedback that I've heard from learners around academics using and faculty using technology to support their learning is that when the academic isn't passionate about using the medium, then the learners aren't passionate about learning. And it's, if you are passionate about your subject and you want to connect with your learners, it's worth the investment of getting to grips with a small range of technologies in order to have a much better learning experience for everybody.
Thank you. We've got a question from Adriana, and she asks, do you have any recommendations, lessons learned from designing self-paced online courses where there is no active tutor mentor involved?
I do. I think you have to be very clear with learners about the outcomes that they're going to achieve and signaling to them when they achieve them. I say a lot to people that if you don't want a lot of tutor involvement in your course, no tutor involvement or very minimal tutor involvement, then your learning materials, your learning activities, and the way that things work within your virtual learning environment have to be second to none. They have to be extremely high quality, because a really good teacher can make the best out of some bad resources. But actually, if there's no tutor to help with those bad resources, then they're just bad resources and the students won't progress. And if you can invest time in thinking about what it will take for your learners to achieve the outcomes, that's the most important thing. And then signal to them along the way what progress they're making. Because the problem with no tutor involvement and completely self-paced classes is that you either do everything on the surface just to get to the end, or you get lost because there's too much work and there isn't enough structure.
Thank you. We are coming to an end, but I think we've got still time for one more question.
Sure.
What if you have a class with presential students present in the class, yes, and online students combined? Do you have any suggestions to have a different and separated groups? What to do with them then?
That hybrid learning, I think, is actually the worst experience for everybody. It's the worst experience for the students in the classroom. It's the worst experience for the students that are virtual, and it's the worst experience for the tutor because they don't know who they're serving. Are you serving the students that are there in front of you? Are you working with them? How do you keep your attention on those learners and make them feel valuable when you've also got to focus on the needs of the learners that are remote from you, that you aren't as well connected to? I get why in the pandemic we're doing this in universities. I get why universities feel they must do this. And I know that it's a resource implication for universities who choose not to do it, where they have some presential students and they have some online students and they teach things twice. But wholeheartedly, I believe, this isn't necessarily Pearson's view, but I believe as an educator that is the worst experience of all for everybody. And if anybody has the solution to that problem, I would love to know it. But all universities go the direction of hybrid teaching. In fact, I get to say my favorite town in Holland, Groningen. It's the only town that I can say properly. It's really, really hard. So if that's you guys out there, I really wish you luck with that. And get in touch when you have the solution to how you get it to work well.
We've got so many fantastic comments on your presentations. It seems that people enjoyed it a lot. And because we've just hit 1 o'clock, I think there'll be time to say goodbye, although there are still many questions in the chat. I think we can go through them later on and put some answers in the website for the conference. So thank you very much, Esther, for fantastic presentation, very informative. We all enjoyed it a lot. And we see each other with the other participants in quarter of an hour for the following sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you all so much for being great participants. You were awesome, all of you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.